And they've stopped the ambulances from going there again, once again.
For one doctor, the stress was too much. Some patients have clearly been traumatized by what's happened to them. Relatives are angry. This woman says she hopes God will bring down the Khalifa family. The hospital beds are full. These were unarmed protesters who'd been marching peacefully when the military started firing live rounds and tear gas at them.
They fired at us from all sides, using guns, rubber bullets and live ammunition. It came from everywhere, from the air, from the riot police and the Air Force. They used tear gas, really all kinds of weapons.
Outside the Salmaniya hospital, crowds began to grow. This had become a place of protest. Down, down, Hamid, a reference to this country's ruler, King Hamid. Hours after the troops opened fire, the injured was still being brought here, to the shock of the crowd. Some of the protesters are already vowing to march again in the coming days. They say the heavy-handed tactics of the authorities will not stop them. AlJazeera, Bahrain.
And we're going to look at international reaction to events across the region a little later this news hour.
In its first reaction to the ongoing events here, the US Embassy has urged the Yemeni government to ensure the safety of the pro-democracy protesters and their rights to speech and rally.
Into Egypt, where hundreds of thousands celebrate their revolution across the country, as the military says it will not tolerate further strikes. That is coming up, plus
those against.
An Arab-sponsored UN resolution branding Israeli settlements illegal is vetoed by the United States. To other news, and after a tense day of voting in Uganda, Yoweri Museveni says he is confident of extending his 25-year reign as leader. Several clashes broke out between supporters of rival candidates, and the opposition says it will protest if these results end up being rigged. Mohammed Ado reports from Kampala.
The Ugandan military on patrol in the east of the country. They were called in to end the fighting between supporters of Uganda's minister, Beatrice Wabudea, and her parliamentary opponent, Nandala Mafabi. Journalists were caught up in the violence. This reporter was shot by security forces. Julius Odeke says he was shot when he refused to hand over his camera.
The windows were closed. I refused to open. At last I had a gunshot and I started feeling myself paralyzed. I saw blood.
And in the capital, Kampala, vote counting commenced immediately. Polling stations closed. Here, opposition supporters cheer every vote for President Museveni's opponents. Tempers flared earlier on in the day when most voting booths did not open on time. Uganda is a fledgling democracy, and this is just its 6th election in 49 years. And presented with the opportunity to vote once again, many Ugandans are doing so with a deep conviction.
I voted for Museveni straight away. He has given us peace.
With the BSJ going through, corruption will have an end. We shall have more drugs in hospitals, better roads than we have.
Kiza Besigye, President Museveni's most formidable challenger, says he doesn't trust the country's election commission. He plans to do his own vote tallying and announcement. The government says he will be arrested if he carries out his threat. And if that happens, things could take a turn for the worse. Mohammed Ado, AlJazeera, Kampala, Uganda.
Nicolas Sarkozy has launched France's presidency of the G20 by warning the world's major economies to put their national interests aside for the good of the group. Delegates are discussing how to identify and measure imbalances in currency values, trade, and capital flows and debt levels. The French president says the aim is to avoid another global financial crisis.
Since last year, the recovery has begun. It's faster than foreseen, but it's unequal. It's not sufficient enough to bring unemployment rates down. Coordination is, and we have to understand this, the only way we will be able to tackle unemployment. It's our only hope. There's no alternative choice.
China appears to be ignoring this call from President Sarkozy. It's rejected plans to use real exchange rates and currency reserves to measure global economic imbalances. Remember, we've got the US consistently saying China keeps its currency, the yuan, undervalued to make its exports cheap. It means the G20 faces a tough task to reach agreement during this two-day meeting. The United States has used its veto power at the UN Security Council to block a Palestinian resolution condemning Israeli settlements. That is despite the other 14 members backing the draft. Instead, Washington offered up a weaker, non-binding presidential statement which rejected the legitimacy of Israel's settlements. From New York, Kristen Salumi has more.
Will those in favor of the draft resolution...
The United States lobbied hard to stop this vote from happening. And when it did...
Those against.
They used their veto power to stop this resolution from becoming law.
The draft resolution has not been adopted.
The draft called for a halt to illegal Israeli settlements in Palestinian territories. Even though the Obama administration has repeatedly criticized Israel's settlement expansion, Ambassador Susan Rice said the resolution risked hardening the positions of both sides.
Our opposition to the resolution before this council today should therefore not be misunderstood to mean we support settlement activity. On the contrary, we reject in the strongest terms the legitimacy of continued Israeli settlement activity.
The Palestine Liberation Organization's executive committee met just hours before the Security Council. The United States tried convincing them to drop the vote, warning that there would be repercussions if it proceeded. The committee decided unanimously to move forward anyway.
We would have liked, of course, to have the Security Council adopt that draft resolution. But I think it was very clear that there is a global consensus on the content of the draft resolution.
The Security Council has successfully passed resolutions on Israeli settlements in the past. In 1967, it called on Israel to fully withdraw from occupied territories. And in 1979, it stated that settlements have, quote, no legal validity and constitute a serious obstruction to achieving peace in the Middle East. With the Arab world awash with demonstrations against leaders who are seen as more in line with the U.S. than their own people, critics of the U.S. say this vote is another sign of waning influence in the region.
They seem to be oblivious to the fact that the whole region is on fire and that their actions today are not the same as they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
The resolution may have failed in the Security Council, but the vote puts the United States in a very awkward position, acting against its stated opposition to Israeli settlement expansion and also against the positions of virtually every other member state here at the UN. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, the United Nations.
So there's perhaps an issue here of the US sending mixed messages, if you like. It says it opposes Israeli settlement building on the one hand, but refuses to let the UN try to stop it. However, the US ambassador to the UN rejected the criticism when she spoke to Daljit Dhaliwal in Washington a little earlier.
Well, the United States' view is that our goal